Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a very relaxing and enjoyable break. We're going to start to finish up the course now with a course review. And this review will be instrumental in taking that final quiz. And I suggest, and I'll say this later on again, I suggest you finish this review, go take the quiz immediately, and then move on to the next lecture, which will be about the final paper. More than anything, this final quiz is going to be about major takeaways. We went over a lot of stuff in this course. I don't know if you realize it or not, but there was a lot of material. And if you take away no more than the items we discussed in this review, I think you'll be ahead of the game. I hope you take away a lot more. But this review is really geared toward helping you on that final quiz, which is an aggregate of everything we've studied across the semester. And if these things stick, then I think you're in pretty good shape. So let's go over them unit by unit and the types of things that you very well may see on this quiz. Our first unit was more of an introduction to each other, and I appreciate that very much. Unit 2 is when we started to talk about Enterprise Security Risk Management, or ESRM. And ESRM is the process of getting valuable input from various partners to determine the holistic risk to a business or entity. So you just need to think of it in terms of the security manager may know security and how to mitigate security vulnerabilities, but they can't possibly know every risk to an organization. You really have to dive deep in. You have to understand where your raw materials come from, what types of hiring issues you may have. Security manager doesn't get normally involved in those things, and the ESRM model is a way for you to get input from all the other disciplines in your organization so you can really understand things that can hurt and harm the business. It's really a process then for understanding and then ranking and ordering those risks, so you can see whether there are some that are common to everybody and some that are more important to the business than others. Because ESRM doesn't mean that every risk gets addressed equally. What it means is every risk gets brought forward so that you can understand what are most impactful, which ones have overlap with others, and try to mitigate those risks in a very ordered fashion so you really hit those high-level risks hard, and your organization is better off and less vulnerable in that way. So remember that ESRM is the process of getting valuable input from the partners across your organization. The reason you do it is the security manager really can't know every risk that's going on in the organization, although many have tried to put together a program that says they can. And the process then helps you understand, rank and order those types of risks, and see where overlap may happen and how a common vulnerability may have a common kind of a mitigation, right? Something you can do one time that helps 2 or 3 partners close a gap. And then it helps you understand what risks are most impactful and puts your efforts behind closing those risks. In Unit 4, we talked about human resources as a partner, and everyone kind of knows what human resources does. It's a very common function in just about any kind of business nowadays. It's an important partner in the ESRM process, and especially for the security manager in general, because you'll work with HR a lot. Mostly during the hiring process and also during disciplines and terminations. But the big thing that HR really does that impacts security more than anything else is the background checks. They may not do them themselves, but they arrange for them. They may have an outside service do them. They may do some of them themselves. But the one thing I want you to remember about background checks is they are not an evaluation of acceptability. Okay, it doesn't tell you that someone is acceptable for a job by looking at their background check. It's a statement of known facts. It's telling you that so-and-so was arrested and convicted of a certain crime at a certain time and date in a certain city. The security manager and HR should, if they're really doing their jobs properly, look at the context of those things. Was this a one-time, many years ago thing that when you look at the case in general, it wouldn't even be something that you'd get a ticket for today? I think marijuana laws probably are the most glaring in this regard. 50 years ago, when you got arrested with marijuana, you were going to prison, whereas today you will maybe get a citation, and in some states it's perfectly legal and you will get nothing. So you have to look at the context, the timing. So really start to think about background checks as just a statement of known facts. They are not an evaluation as to whether someone's acceptable. You also have to remember that the job and the background check have a lot to do with each other. If you're hiring someone that will never drive a company vehicle, and they have a drunk driving charge on their record, then you really can't hold that against them because they're never going to drive a vehicle. There is no likelihood that crime would affect the way they perform the position. So again, background check's not an evaluation of acceptability. It's a statement of known facts, and then HR and security get together to discuss acceptability. In Unit 5, we talked about finance, and we had really budgeting was our main focus. Finance is a fantastic friend to security and just about every other business entity because they hold the purse strings, and you'll need money to operate your part of the business. In budgeting, we used a line item budget where we just listed the things we might need, right? ID cards, radios, guard services, the types of things a security manager might need, and what the cost of those things should be, and simply manage to the bottom line. When all those lines are added up, we have a total budget for our expenses, and we're going to manage to that number. Generally speaking, when you prepare a budget, you will prepare either cost-based budget, which means you take into account what you spent last year on something, and simply add a percentage or two or subtract a percentage or two based on how costs are going for certain things. Sometimes costs of things like ID cards are coming down because there are more manufacturers of them. Guard services, anything having to do with labor, generally you add a couple percent, 2 to 5% for wage increases and the like. And then you build your budget from there, from what you spent. Or you zero base, and you start with a blank sheet of paper and you justify everything you need based on what the actual cost should be. Zero-based budgeting takes more time to prepare, but you'll find that it gives you more synergies. It really makes you justify. A zero-based budget makes you justify everything in your budget from scratch. Generally speaking, you also have two budgets that you'll prepare. An expense budget, which is the daily operating expenses, salaries, office supplies, raw materials, types of things you need to get materials in the front door and out the front door that you're going to use every day. Those you pay for in the year in which you buy them. Or capital items. Buildings, high-value manufacturing equipment, sometimes vehicles, especially expensive, trucks to move materials around. Those types of things you buy with a capital budget. And you're able then to spread the payments of those, essentially, across several budget years for budgeting purposes. The reason is that if you have $1 million budget, and you also need $1 million piece of equipment, you would spend your entire budget for the year on that. You'd have no money left over to pay people and to buy office supplies and the other things you need to move along. So you essentially capitalize that purchase across several years, and it's like an internal loan to yourself. And for tax purposes, it's an easier hit to your budget. And if that asset that you bought, that big ticket item, becomes impaired in some way, you no longer need it, it gets damaged, it's no longer valuable to you, you can write it all off in 1 year and be done with that. So the big thing to remember is a zero-based budget is something you should do every few years, but it takes the longest to prepare. And expense items are paid for in the year you use them, and capital items can be spread over multiple years. If you remember those things in finance, you'll be able to listen at your first financial meeting as a new security manager and probably be able to keep up. In Unit 6, we talked about facilities and engineering, a very important partner for security managers. They normally control the capital budget simply because finance allows them to make decisions when it comes to capital budgeting because they handle the majority of big projects, building projects and the like. So facilities and engineering has a lot of input into capital budgets. If you ask for a capital item that's a big ticket item some year, you may want to go and socialize that with the facilities people as well. They also control space planning, and that is a big item for security people. If you're going to protect someone who's vulnerable, you don't want to necessarily put them on the corner office at the ground floor in front of a bunch of windows, which is normally where the CEO's office is. And it's crazy that you think you can protect the CEO when they sit with their back to a big piece of glass to the outside world. When space planning is being done by the facilities and engineering department, the security person wants input into that. You want to make sure that if you have a medical facility inside of your business, a nurse's office, if you will, an EHS facility where people go for occupational health, you want that close to an exit, and you want it so it's accessible so that you can get a gurney through the hallways, because security is going to help escort those people back and forth if an ambulance is called. Same with the executives. You want to be able to convince them that the executives should be one floor up, perhaps on an interior hallway in a courtyard as opposed to on the outside where people can see them from the outside world. There's a real interest security has in renovations and space planning in protecting vulnerable populations and also making sure that security devices get placed as part of those projects. So the thing to remember with facilities and engineering is, for the security manager, the most important thing is they control space planning. And if you can put people in the right places to protect them, that's going to pay back big dividends And if you can put the right security measures in place while you're building something, that's certainly going to make your life a lot easier. In Unit 7, we talked about the regulatory environment. And you are responsible, whether you know what the law is or not, for obeying it. You've all heard that said before. Ignorance is no defense. There are many things in business that security gets tasked with doing that they may not even know they've been tasked with. Part of the ESRM model, then, really is for you to sit down with people, and when you're asking them what risks they have to their business, also ask them what they expect security to be doing to support their business. They may say that they have written into a policy that security will do these things, or that they have a regulation that they must abide by, and it has a security component, and they need to make you aware of that. Now, understanding the difference between regulations, standards, and internal controls is important. Regulations are supported by law, normally administrative law. But think about financial reporting laws, environmental laws. These are things you must do. If you don't do them, you can be fined heavily, or you could go to jail. Standards are normally voluntary. You try to set up a standard that you abide by because it tells your customers that you do things in a certain way. So ISO standards, NIST standards for those in computer science. You're saying that we're going to follow the following industry guidelines, and you can be assured that we'll keep this certification and we will do things in this way. Internal controls are just set to differentiate you from competitors. We only use the finest herbs and ingredients in our chicken, as KFC will tell you, right? Those are internal controls. There's nothing that says they must do that, but they espouse to do that because they want to differentiate themselves from their competitors. So what you need to remember is regulations, laws, standards, normally in an accrediting body, and you're going to follow those because you want people to know that you do things in a certain way. Internal controls are your own promises that you make to your customers and to others that say you're going to do things in a certain way that really aren't audited by anyone else. We went on to Unit 8, and we talked about external partnerships. And for the most part, the local police is going to be the most important external relationship that a security manager has. We read Sari and Presler, and they gave us the models that we could potentially operate in. There are many others, and there are hybrids of those models, but they went over the different types of relationship models that you can have with local police. And some can be highly defined, like the property model, which just says you stay in your property and they stay in the public property. Division of labor, there are certain things police can do and certain things security can do, and you always stay in your lane. They can be looser, the supplementary service model. Whoever's best to accomplish that will accomplish it by design. And the combined forces model, very similar to the supplementary service model, basically says that there's going to be cooperation between the two. And that's a more loose kind of a standard because it's not as defined as to who's going to do what, but situation can sometimes dictate. And then they can be made through formal agreements like the ad hoc model. In the case of a response that you may have for workplace violence, having an ad hoc model, which is a written formal process that the police will follow when they come to your facility, is a great model to adhere to. The one thing I want you to remember with these models is, number one, we saw the statistics that the police generally have a lower opinion of private security. In that regard, they will most likely try to set the model of operation between you and them. This is what we will do for you, and this is how we want you to do it. The security manager, if he's smart, starts to work toward influencing that model and setting the model that's best for their employer. And that may not always be the best one for the police, so it requires some negotiation. But the security manager should work to set the model in the best interest of their employer. That's the main person that you owe the loyalty to, and so long as you're acting in an ethical and legal manner, that is where your emphasis should be put. So knowing that the police have a relatively low opinion of private security professionals are tasked with trying to influence the police to use a model that treats them in a way that is respectful to both and gets the job done. In Unit 9, we talked about the security team itself. And security teams take many forms. We used the example of a 300-person company in a mid-sized town. But if you had a company of 100,000 people, and you were in a major metropolitan city, if you were at a huge auto manufacturing plant, which in some cases can have 10,000 people, you may have a different layout for your security department. But generally speaking, the security manager has a team to work with. They may include shift leaders, guards, administrators, and system support. They could be contracted. It could be a mixture, a hybrid. of the security manager being an in-house employee, along with the shift leaders and the guards, administrators, and system support being contracted. Could go the other way around. Could be all contracted, could be all proprietary. The mixture really is dependent on what the needs of your employer are. The one thing I would like you to think about, though, is when you have system support, it's almost always contracted. And the reason for that is it takes a lot of time and effort to train people in all of the new electronics that come out every day in the world, and it would just be unwielding for you to try to have an in-house person and send them to constant training. Whereas a contracted company that concentrates on system support will always have that ongoing training as part of their operational model. So in almost every case, system support is and should be, in my opinion, contracted out because it just gives you more bang for the buck and is less distracting. The one thing that's very important to remember is even though you have this security team and you have all of these security experts and professionals and all that knowledge, the ESRM model still tells us that the security manager is the subject matter expert, but the process is owned by all the partners. And remember that the ESRM process is owned by all the partners. The security manager is the facilitator and the subject matter expert on the security portions of that plan. Unit 10 was about business enablement, and you all came up with some really good ways that a security team, if one were to be formed at Slippery Rock, could influence students in a positive way and give them more time to concentrate on their studies. It really is about helping other partners. When you look at ways the security team, since they're out there 24/7, could take on some other functions, and it makes smart business for them to take that on. I think one of the ones that was, kept coming up that was good, I believe, was the salting and shoveling of some sidewalks, or the opening of classrooms at the beginning of a day, rather than wait for the instructor to get there at the last minute and then open up the classroom, then having to settle in and turn on the projector. A lot of you saw the security person doing that as a smart move, and it really would save time and effort. One of the ones that I saw that came up a lot was, they could work the register in the dining hall. It's a good idea to have more people opening up registers in the dining hall. That was obvious, but I'm not so sure that wasn't distracting for security. So you're taking on non-standard roles that help the rest of the business succeed. But one of the major drawbacks is that you don't want to give the security officers a job that totally distracts them from the security function. While you're shoveling a walk or throwing out salt, you're outside, you're watching what's going on. You really are doing two jobs at once. Working the cash register at the dining hall, not so sure that would be one that you could really do much security function. I guess you could look for shoplifting and other things, but for the most part, you want to make sure that it's somewhat related to the security function and doesn't detract. The real premise, though, behind business enablement is that it's not about whose job is it to do something, but rather who's best positioned to do that job by the function they're normally assigned to do. So again, the security person is doing rounds in a building as part of their normal work. They could check the fire extinguishers and the hoses to make sure they're all intact and the gauges are right, rather than send a safety person around to do that and just following the guard around in their tracks. So it's really about business enablement is about who is best positioned to do a job, whether or not that job is theirs to do. And as long as they have the basic training and does not detract from their normal duties, then they would enable the business by taking on that role themselves, even though it's not part of their core business. And finally, in Unit 12, we talked about security managers as leaders. And I think that you can't have one without the other if you want to succeed. And we saw that in the G4S example. And we really set our own definitions, but I think they apply, and I think they are very useful to you as you go forward. And that management involves the rules and standards we operate from. Leadership involves the way we apply and obey those rules and standards. So if we had a failure of management, being a verb, right? A failure of management is present when we do not have good written practices. When we don't have good rules in place. If we say we can hire somebody without doing a background check, it's not written anywhere that you have to have a background check, I will tell you that we will probably hire some undesirable people in our organization. A failure of leadership is present when we have those rules, but we simply blow them off and don't obey them. So we have a rule that says we will do a background check on everyone, and anyone who doesn't pass, set to the standards we decide on what is pass and fail, will not be hired. Then that's good management. But it's poor leadership if we say, well, yes, but we really need that person to start Tuesday, and we don't have enough people to do the work, so we'll bring that person in anyway. neither can operate without the other. You really need the management function of having good rules established and processes in place, and then you need the leadership to make sure that those rules get obeyed and you follow your own internal rules. The reason that you need to follow those internal rules is because we found that there's no consistent government laws or regulations around private security really in the U.S. Different states have different rules. In fact, even some counties have different rules around licensing, but there was no and is not a national standard around private security. And globally, that is true in any market that I've ever done business. There is not a national standard anywhere. Some have some rules. A security guard cannot be a felon. A security guard must have X amount of training in hours, but none of it is consistent across any country in the world that I've done business in. I can't say that there isn't a country somewhere that has it right, but the reason that you need to make sure you have good management, written rules, and good leadership, enforcement, and obeying of those rules is because there isn't a formal standard that will hold people accountable. So we need to do that as a self-enforcement model. So I'm sure you printed this out and took some notes on it. I suggest you go immediately to the quiz. Take the quiz, get it out of the way. Don't overthink the questions. They're pretty straightforward. This is more of a repeat what you know quiz. We have had many quizzes where it's best answer or you have to determine which answer is more correct than another. This one's a little more straightforward because I just want you to understand all of the things that you learned in the last 14 weeks or so. Once you're done, move to the next lecture on the final paper. Okay, so you're finished with this one. I suggest if you have the time, you've set aside the time, go take the quiz now, get that out of the way, and then move on to the lecture about the final paper, which is really just about layout and the expectations. There will be an assignment on that where you're going to do just a few sentences here and there for the outline and drop that in the Dropbox. So you finish this lecture, take the quiz, go on to the lecture about the final paper, which is really just a layout discussion about your final paper, and you'll fill in the parts that you'll see in the lecture. You'll print that out, and then you'll put that in the Dropbox, and then you'll move on to the final paper. With that, good luck on the quiz, and we will talk again soon.